In May 1967, at Hill 881, after a bloody close-quarters battle, field reports sent back to the U.S. command in Saigon carried a humiliating reality. Numerous bodies of U.S. Marine Corps soldiers lay scattered beside M16 rifles that had been stripped apart piece by piece. They did not fall due to a lack of skill or courage. They died because their weapons had gone on strike at the very moment of life and death. This was not an ordinary technical malfunction. It was a nationally scaled ritual of humiliation. A technological superpower with an unlimited defense budget sent its sons into battle armed with a sleek but useless plastic toy, while the opposing side firmly wielded mud-caked AK-47s that were astonishingly durable. The so-called space-age weapon was in reality a mechanical catastrophe that stripped the GI soldier of the most basic right of self-defense at the very threshold of death. We are laying bare the greatest betrayal in 20th century U.S. military history, where the military-industrial alliance placed profit above the lives of soldiers. The Vietnamese battlefield was turned into a slaughterhouse not because of the weakness of the soldier, but because of ruthless cost-cutting decisions and pathological arrogance emanating from air-conditioned offices in Washington.
The failure of the M16 in Vietnam was a systematic crime concealed beneath the label of a technological revolution. Eugene Stoner designed a masterpiece, but officials at the Pentagon and the Colt Corporation turned it into a deadly trap. They carried out a spectacular deception by assuring soldiers that it was a self-cleaning weapon, which led to gun cleaning kits not being issued to them during some of the fiercest phases of combat. This was irresponsibility taken to the level of cruelty. Under 95% humidity and the thick mud of the jungle, even a single grain of dust or a trace of moisture was enough to turn the M16's direct gas impingement system into a rigid piece of jammed scrap metal. But the real fatal flaw lay in fraud within the ammunition logistics chain. In order to save money and make use of leftover propellant stockpiled from World War II, the military changed the propellant formula from standard IMR powder to a cheaper ball powder. This powder produced several times more carbon fouling, which, combined with the direct gas impingement system that vents propellant gases and carbon directly into the bolt carrier, created a filthy adhesive mixture that wedged spent cartridge cases tightly in the chamber. The result was the horrifying frequency of failure to extract. 19-year-old boys having to use cleaning rods to knock stuck casings out in the middle of enemy fire stood as proof of the complete collapse of American moral authority. The Pentagon traded the lives of American soldiers for cost-saving figures on contractors' accounting ledgers. This humiliation extended to the primary squad automatic weapon, the M60 machine gun, also known as the Pig. Despite its reputation as overwhelming squad-level firepower, the M60 was a nightmare of flawed ergonomic design. Mounting the bipod directly to the barrel was a fatal mistake. In the middle of battle, to replace a cherry red-hot barrel after sustained automatic fire, the gunner was forced to carry out a slow procedure, dismantling the entire bipod assembly at a moment of life and death. If the asbestos protective glove was lost or torn, the soldier would immediately suffer severe third-degree burns upon touching the hot steel. Even more terrifying was the runaway gun syndrome, when extreme heat warped internal components, causing the weapon to fire uncontrollably until the entire belt was expended. It turned into a mad beast, spewing bullets indiscriminately and directly threatening the lives of comrades within the formation. The counterproductive nature of American technology was also evident in the M79 grenade launcher. Although a weapon with considerable destructive power, its spin-activated fuse mechanism rendered it useless in close-range engagements under 15 to 20 meters, the most common scenario in jungle ambushes. In the jungles of Vietnam, where the enemy often appeared suddenly at distances of only a few steps, an M79 round fired was merely a piece of metal because it lacked sufficient distance to arm the fuse.
The naivety of weapon designers working in air-conditioned rooms in the United States turned soldiers in the field into victims of the very equipment they were told was state-of-the-art. American soldiers were placed in an almost unimaginable situation. They fought in a war where the enemy was not only highly skilled guerrilla fighters, but the very firearms they held in their hands. The arrogance of a technological superpower was mercilessly exposed by the reality of mud and mire. When faith in steel collapsed, the soldier was left with only the most primitive survival instincts in a green hell filled with invisible traps that no electronic sighting system could ever detect.
When faith in individual weapons had been crushed by jammed M16 rifles, the Pentagon placed all its hope in the brute force of armored formations. They believed that the dozens of millimeters thick steel armor of the M48 Patton tank or the M113 armored personnel carrier would be an absolute shield, crushing all enemy resistance beneath iron tracks. But the reality in Vietnam turned this pride into a catastrophe of operational thinking. Machines worth millions of dollars, designed to sweep across the plains of Europe, proved completely helpless and became true steel coffins. The first and most deadly mistake lay with the M113 armored vehicle, the U.S. military's primary troop carrier. To optimize amphibious capability and transport by C-130 aircraft, American engineers used an aluminum alloy hull instead of hardened rolled steel. This was an extraordinarily cruel trade-off. The aluminum could stop rifle fire, but against guerrilla anti-armor weapons such as the RPG-2 or B-40, it was as fragile as a sheet of foil. When a shaped charge round struck the hull, the extreme heat melted the aluminum, creating a jet of molten metal that sprayed directly into the troop compartment, turning the interior into a true hell. But the real crime in the M113's design was the placement of the fuel tank. Defense contractors positioned the fuel tank inside the troop compartment to save space. What was the result? A single accurate hit from the rear or flank did not merely cause mechanical damage, it instantly turned the vehicle into a mobile crematorium. The soldiers inside had no chance to escape if the rear ramp jammed or the fire spread too quickly. This was the ultimate ritual of humiliation. GIs preferred to sit exposed on top of the vehicle, turning themselves into sniper targets, rather than sit inside the so-called protective armor that was, in reality, a latent incinerator. The Pentagon ignored this for years, indifferent to the blood of soldiers soaking into the aluminum floors of these obsolete machines. Nor did it end there. The M48 Patton medium tank, symbol of American destructive power, shared the same humiliating fate. Weighing over 50 tons, the M48 became useless amid muddy rice paddies and the jungles of the Central Highlands. When its tracks sank deep into the mud, it became a gigantic fixed target. Guerrillas did not need advanced weapons to neutralize it. Improvised mines or pit traps were enough. A superpower having to use heavy lift helicopters to rescue a tank stuck in mud was proof of the collapse of technological moral authority. American arrogance was broken by the very ground they sought to pacify. While the United States struggled with million-dollar breakdowns, the opposing side deployed a weapon costing less than 1 cent, yet inflicting psychological damage more devastating than any firepower. Punji traps. Do not mistake these for primitive hunting tools. They were part of a war of attrition strategy calculated with the utmost brutality in history. The spikes were not merely sharpened bamboo, they were selected from the oldest bamboo, fire-hardened to achieve steel-like hardness, and, most importantly, coated with poison, snake venom, or organic waste. The purpose of punji traps was not immediate killing. If a soldier died, the army lost 1 man. But if a soldier was wounded by a spike, the American logistics system was stretched to its limits. Wounds caused by bamboo spikes often infected rapidly, inflicting extreme pain and requiring at least 2 comrades to help carry the casualty out of the combat zone. With a single jungle bamboo spike, the enemy immobilized the fighting capacity of at least 3 soldiers and consumed thousands of dollars in medical costs for each medvac. This was the horrifying backlash of modern warfare. A nation that sent humans to the moon was watching its son's feet rot from crude bamboo spikes. The arrogance of civilization was slapped in the face by flip traps hidden beneath dry leaves. American soldiers began to fear the very ground beneath their feet. Every step in the jungle was no longer a march, but a life-and-death gamble. Panic spread as they realized that million-dollar steel armor could not protect them from bamboo spikes, and that their enemy was not only in front of them or behind them, but present directly beneath their boots. A world of darkness awaited, ready to swallow those who dared to trespass upon the land below.
When mechanized power was subdued on the surface by mud and punji traps, the U.S. military was forced to confront something even more horrifying: the guerrillas' nationwide tunnel system. These were not merely ordinary shelters, they were a vast network of psychological warfare, a labyrinth of death stretching hundreds of kilometers beneath the forests. Here, every kind of carpet bombing from B-52 Stratofortresses or massed artillery fire became meaningless. To counter it, the Pentagon created a special unit bearing a deeply humiliating name: the Tunnel Rats. This was the ultimate ritual of humiliation for the pride of the U.S. infantry. Tall young men, white and non-white alike, trained to operate the most advanced military equipment in the world, were now forced to strip off all armor, discard cutting-edge electronic devices, and carry only a Colt .45 pistol and a handheld flashlight. They had to crawl on elbows and knees through earthen passages so narrow they were suffocating, where the air was thick with the smell of damp soil, sweat, and the scent of death lurking nearby. In the pitch-black darkness of the Ku Chi or Ving Mok tunnels, America's so-called technological superiority was reduced to zero. America's helplessness underground was a catastrophe of the human psyche. The tunnel rat faced humanity's most primal fears: claustrophobia combined with absolute darkness. If a flashlight battery died or the light failed, the soldier would be swallowed by darkness, unable to distinguish direction, becoming a solitary corpse beneath the earth. Vietnamese guerrillas designed their tunnels with U-shaped water-filled bends to block poison gas, ultra-small ventilation holes, and lethal trapdoors. Every square meter of ground beneath an American soldier's feet was a trap calculated to crush his sanity. But the most brutal element, the one that drove even the toughest tunnel rats mad, was the tactic of using legless assassins. Guerrillas elevated biological warfare to its utmost cruelty by exploiting jungle fauna. They captured highly venomous green pit vipers, often called by U.S. soldiers two-step snakes, because after being bitten one could only take 2 steps before dying, or forest scorpions, then suspended them upside down from tunnel ceilings at the narrowest points using thin cords. Or, worse still, they stuffed them inside hollow bamboo tubes placed along the tunnel routes. When an American soldier's flashlight beam swept past, the animal, agitated by the light and sound, would strike directly at the victim's neck, shoulder, or face. In the cramped space where movement was impossible, a snakebite was an immediate death sentence. The heart-rending screams of a soldier trapped underground, the ragged breathing in oxygen-poor air, and the absolute helplessness of comrades above ground who could not intervene created a horrifying strategic backlash. A superpower possessing nuclear weapons was completely halted by snakes and crude clay tunnels. The tunnels also concealed mechanical traps that were ingenious yet unbelievably simple. Flip traps hiding poison-coated spikes beneath tight bends, where American soldiers had to crawl using both hands and knees, made it impossible to control where limbs were placed. A sudden stab to the hand or knee in the darkness could lead to necrosis and blood infection within hours.
The Pentagon's arrogance about pacifying the land was shattered by Vietnam's own earth. Every centimeter of soil here knew how to kill. The rate of psychological trauma among tunnel rat units was the highest of the entire war. They were haunted by the faint sound of digging, by the sensation of reptiles slithering across their skin in the dark. They came to realize that no matter how much firepower they possessed, they were outsiders, rats driven through a domain that was not theirs. The collapse of moral authority came when American soldiers realized they were fighting an unwinnable war against an enemy willing to turn the earth into a home and venomous creatures into comrades. When the lucky American soldiers escaped from beneath the ground, they believed they had finally seen the light, but no. The Vietnamese jungle still held other silent killers lying in wait, things that required neither venom nor bullets, yet possessed the power to wipe out an entire division with a single breath of the great forest. That is when we must speak of the nightmare of tropical medicine, a realm where even America's finest doctors were left utterly helpless.
When M16 rifles betrayed soldiers on the surface and green pit vipers waited for them in the tunnels, a third enemy, far more invisible and ruthless, began to infiltrate every pore of the GI soldier. It was the rise of tropical diseases, where all Western medical knowledge was utterly broken. This was a scientific ritual of humiliation. A superpower possessing nuclear technology and state-of-the-art biomedical laboratories proved completely helpless against tiny parasites lurking in muddy pools and rotting leaf canopies. At the top of the blacklist, the silent terror haunting every American platoon was jungle malaria. But this was not the ordinary malaria familiar to U.S. doctors. In the deep forests of the Central Highlands and along jungle trails, American troops encountered a highly drug-resistant strain of Plasmodium falciparum. Declassified medical reports reveal a catastrophic truth. At certain times, the number of soldiers removed from the ranks due to malaria exceeded casualties caused by enemy fire. Fevers so high they induced delirium, violent shivering fits amid the stifling jungle heat turned hardened fighters into walking skeletons in as little as 2 weeks. The weekly distribution of prophylactic pills became an invisible act of cruelty by command. The drug's side effects caused severe gastrointestinal distress and hallucinations, leaving soldiers exhausted even before encountering the enemy. The Pentagon spent billions of dollars on new medications, yet tropical parasites in Vietnam always seemed one step ahead, turning American soldiers' bodies into a biological battlefield in which they were perpetually the losers. But the true nightmare that terrified every GI whenever he removed his boots was jungle ulcer syndrome. In conditions where humidity consistently exceeded 95%, thick leather boots and heavy American uniforms became perfect incubators for bacteria and fungi. A single small abrasion from a thorn or an insect bite would never heal. Under bacterial assault, the wound began to suppurate, spread, and eat down to the bone marrow. Thousands of soldiers were horrified to watch their feet rot inside their boots while they were still forced to march. This was the complete collapse of technological moral authority. A nation proud of hygiene and medicine allowed its soldiers to decay, literally. The most advanced medical system in the world capitulated to a jungle fungus. The final solution was often amputation or evacuation to the rear in disgrace. The stench of rotting flesh mixed with mud became the signature smell of American field hospitals, a scent of biological defeat. Nor did it end there. Water, the sustainer of life, became a naturally vicious biological weapon. Amoebic dysentery and leptospirosis lurked in streams that appeared crystal clear or in rain-filled bomb craters. American soldiers, even when equipped with advanced iodine water purification tablets, could not prevent parasites from entering through mucous membranes or open wounds. Acute bouts of diarrhea causing severe dehydration turned search-and-destroy operations into death marches. An army nourished by scientific diets and clean canned food completely unraveled when its digestive systems were destroyed by indigenous microorganisms.
the backlash of chemical warfare began to surface. To strip foliage, the United States sprayed millions of liters of Agent Orange, never anticipating that the destruction of ecosystems would alter the behavior of insects and animals, making vector-borne diseases harder to control. American soldiers not only inhaled their own chemical poisons, but also faced an environment that was rebelling against the invaders. Physical exhaustion led to mental collapse. When soldiers saw comrades fall to nameless fevers, watched their own limbs ulcerate beyond the reach of any cure, they realized that death in Vietnam did not come only from the barrels of AK-47s, but from every drop of dew, every sip of water, and every breath. The jungle was devouring them alive from the inside. But even when they were utterly exhausted and stripped of the ability to defend themselves, the jungle still held one final suicide squad. Apex predators at the top of the food chain, creatures indifferent to politics or ideology, yet endowed with killing instincts before which even America's finest snipers had to bow. That was when they were forced to confront the true kings of the night.
When M16 rifles had become jammed decorations, when armored forces were trapped inside aluminum coffins, and when GI bodies were rotting from disease, the Vietnamese jungle played its final card to see off the invaders. Apex predators at the top of the food chain. For American soldiers, this was the most horrifying chapter in their war diary. The moment they realized they were not hunters on a freedom mission, but merely weak prey in the eyes of the Indo-Chinese tiger. Data from declassified reports of the 4th Infantry Division and the 101st Division recorded unexplained disappearances of night sentries at border fire bases. Vietnamese tigers of that period were not afraid of gunfire. On the contrary, they were attracted by the smell of blood, canned food, and the chaos of the battlefield. There were terrifying cases in which a tiger weighing more than 200 kilograms silently penetrated defensive perimeters equipped with thermal sensors and tangled barbed wire, dragging away a soldier sleeping in his bivouac sack without making a single sound. This was the ultimate ritual of humiliation for the honor of the U.S. military. Soldiers armed to the teeth with round-the-clock air support became food for wild beasts. The presence of these striped phantoms triggered an unprecedented psychological catastrophe. At bases in the Central Highlands, American troops feared the darkness of the jungle more than guerrilla fighters. When even the most advanced night vision optics failed to detect a native predator moving without a sound, Washington's pride in technological superiority completely collapsed. A nation that proclaimed itself the world's policeman could not protect its own sentries from the claws of nature. The backlash of chemical warfare reached a level of bitter irony. To strip the enemy of cover, the United States sprayed millions of liters of Agent Orange, killing vegetation. But this act destroyed ecosystems, driving to extinction small animals that were the natural prey of tigers and leopards. As a result, the most ferocious predators were pushed into desperation and forced to attack military bases in search of humans as an alternative protein source. The cruelty inflicted upon the U.S. military upon nature returned to punish them in the most fitting way. It was not only tigers. The jungle also unleashed other giant warriors, wild elephants. While American tanks were immobilized by mud, herds of wild elephants moved with power across ravines and all types of terrain. There were reports of elephants attacking supply convoys, overturning jeeps, and destroying expensive radar stations. American troops were even forced to use heavy machine guns and artillery to stop the charges of wild animals. Having to use modern weapons of war against wildlife was proof of the impasse and blindness of a superpower that had strayed too far beyond the bounds of humanity and natural law. The collapse of moral authority came when American soldiers looked back and saw themselves defeated by an unthinkable alliance: courageous guerrillas, crude bamboo punji traps,
tropical bacteria, and jungle beasts. The Pentagon could calculate ammunition quantities, but it could never calculate the soul of a land. When faith in steel and technology collapsed, what remained was only a shameful retreat. This indictment ends with the image of the final helicopters lifting off from the roof of the Saigon embassy, leaving behind a jungle still lush, mysterious, and filled with fangs. The American superpower entered Vietnam with the arrogance of a master of the universe, but withdrew bearing scars that would never heal in the minds of an entire generation. Vietnam was not merely a battlefield, it was a costly lesson in this truth. When you declare war on a people bound to their land, you are declaring war on nature and history itself. And in that war, million-dollar technology has never been and never will be the ultimate victor over the power of primal survival. If you have reached these final moments, you will understand that the Vietnam War was not just statistics. It was where the modern world was forced to kneel before the natural world. If you find these declassified truths valuable, please press like, subscribe, and share so that these historical lessons are not forgotten. We will meet again in the next dark files of world military history.